The house was unusually quiet that Friday evening, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost suffocating. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his arms crossed over a stack of papers, Alex's latest report card glaring up at him like an accusation. The grades weren't terrible, not failing, but they were enough to ignite Daniel's temper. His jaw tightened as he imagined a weekend of endless video games replacing hours that could have been spent studying. "Elena," he said, voice low but firm, "we need to talk about Alex's grades." Elena glanced up from the counter where she had been peeling apples. Her fingers paused mid-motion, apple juice dripping onto the tile. She knew this conversation was coming, the inevitable clash between discipline and indulgence. She didn't speak, letting Daniel take the lead as he always did. "I've decided," Daniel continued, flipping the report card to emphasize the B- in math. "No video games this weekend. He needs to focus. This is not negotiable." Elena's lips pressed together. She understood Daniel's reasoning, yet a part of her resented the way he imposed his authority, as if Alex's every decision was a battlefield. "Maybe a little compromise," she began, but Daniel's glare silenced her before the words could fully form. "Compromise?" Daniel's voice hardened, the tone that always cut through the air like a knife. "He needs consequences. This is how he learns responsibility." Alex, lying in his room upstairs, heard every word. At first he froze, pretending to play a game on his phone, but his knuckles whitened around the device. The idea of being cut off from his digital world felt like a punishment, heavier than any grounding. Rage stirred quietly, coiling in his chest. Downstairs, Daniel stood and walked toward the living room, running a hand through his hair, pacing like a caged animal. This isn't just about grades, it's about respect, about understanding that life isn't all fun and games. Elena watched him, the familiar swell of frustration and fear rising. She wanted to intervene, to soften the blow for Alex, but something in Daniel's intensity froze her in place. The tension in the room was palpable, like static before a storm. She could sense Alex's presence in the house even without seeing him, the subtle creak of floorboards, the muffled sighs escaping his room. And though her instinct was to shield him, to offer reassurance and safety, she remained silent. She had learned long ago that Daniel's decisions were absolute, and that silence was often the only way to keep the peace. Daniel finally returned to the kitchen table, sitting down heavily. He tapped the report card with a firm finger, as if emphasizing the gravity of every B, every C, every mistake. "I won't tolerate laziness. Not under my roof." Eleanor's hands, resting on the counter, tightened around the edge. She felt a wave of guilt and apprehension wash over her. Was she failing Alex by not speaking up? Or was she failing Daniel by even questioning him in her mind? The ambiguity of her emotions twisted like a knot inside her chest. Upstairs, Alex's anger began to take shape. He clenched his fists, feeling the first seeds of defiance planted in fertile soil. His mind ran through scenarios, small acts of rebellion, fleeting thoughts of revenge, and yet beneath it all, there was a raw, simmering sense of being unheard, of being controlled. As night settled over the house, the lights dimmed and shadows stretched across the walls. A quiet tension lingered in every room. Daniel returned to his papers, Eleanor to her apples, and Alex to his thoughts. The weekend promised boredom and frustration, but for Alex, it also promised the stirrings of a plan, one he couldn't yet articulate, yet one that grew stronger in the silence of the family home. The ban was more than a restriction. It was the first crack in a fragile equilibrium, and in that quiet, unseen fissure, a storm was beginning to form. Elena lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the streetlights outside. The house was quiet now, but the quiet felt unnatural, heavy, oppressive. She could hear the subtle creaks of the floorboards above. Alex, shifting in his bed, restless, likely replaying the earlier confrontation over and over in his mind. She wanted to rise, to go upstairs and soothe him, But a part of her hesitated. She had learned that stepping between Daniel and Alex often led to her own frustration, and sometimes even Daniel's anger. Memories flickered in her mind like a broken film reel. She remembered when she and Daniel had first married, full of hope and laughter. But over the years, something had shifted. Daniel's rigidness had grown, and she had learned to pick her battles carefully. Their conversations now felt like careful negotiations, each word weighed, each silence measured. Alex, once a cheerful child, had become sensitive to every tone, every glance, every unspoken judgment. She turned toward the kitchen clock, its dim glow marking the slow passage of time. The tension in her chest made her stomach twist. She knew she couldn't blame Daniel entirely. He believed in discipline and structure. Yet something about the way he had spoken to Alex tonight, sharp, uncompromising, left her uneasy. She thought of the son she had once known, full of laughter and curiosity, now simmering quietly, brooding in his room. Elena's mind wandered further back, to her own childhood, to the lessons she had learned about obedience, silence, and restraint. She realized with a pang that she had unconsciously repeated those patterns in her own marriage. She had taught herself to stay quiet in the face of conflict, to smile when frustration welled inside, to soften blows she couldn't prevent, and yet, now she wondered whether her silence was protecting Alex, or leaving him more alone in his anger than ever. Downstairs, Daniel stirred in his sleep, a low hum of restlessness escaping him. Eleanor could almost feel the invisible walls between them, the emotional distance that had grown steadily over the years. They were under the same roof, yet their worlds rarely intersected beyond the practicalities of life. Bills, schedules, chores, homework. She longed for the connection they had once shared, the warmth that had drawn her to him, but it felt like a memory from another life. Elena's gaze drifted to the framed family photographs on the wall, the smiling faces frozen in time. Alex's, tiny hand clutching a toy truck, Daniel grinning in the sun, herself oblivious to the storm that would later follow. The images seemed like lies now, false markers of a happiness that had eroded silently. The sound of a door creaking upstairs pulled her from her thoughts. Alex was moving again, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. She imagined him pacing, perhaps staring at the locked cabinet where his video games were hidden. The thought made her stomach knot. How had they arrived at this point, where a simple weekend ban could feel like a verdict, a punishment, almost unbearable? She considered intervening, but the words caught in her throat. How could she argue with Daniel when she herself wasn't entirely certain where her own loyalties lay? She loved her son, yes, but she also feared Daniel's wrath, his judgment, his insistence on control. In the middle of the night, Eleanor felt herself caught between two storms: her husband's discipline and her son's growing fury. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the tension. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting in, the dim glow of the streetlights. Eleanor felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on her chest. This silence wasn't peaceful. It was a prelude, a fragile calm before a storm whose shape she couldn't yet predict. Upstairs, Alex's thoughts churned. Downstairs, Daniel's rigid routines had created cracks in the family's foundation, cracks that Elena could feel spreading beneath her feet. And in the quiet, Eleanor realized with a shiver that the weekend ahead was not merely a test of Alex's obedience. It was a test of all their limits, a slow reveal of the fractures they had long ignored. The first real fissures in their fragile family life had appeared tonight, and Eleanor sensed that they would not remain hidden for long. Alex sat on the edge of his bed, the dim glow of his phone casting pale light across his face. The screen displayed nothing, yet he didn't need it. His mind was already replaying the confrontation downstairs, the sharp tone of Daniel, the tight press of Elena's lips, the locked cabinet where his games now lay useless. Rage simmered beneath his chest, a slow, methodical burn. He wasn't crying, wasn't yelling. He was planning. In the stillness of his room, Alex felt both trapped and omnipotent. trapped because the weekend ban confined him to boredom, to hours of staring at walls, and omnipotent because he knew he could act if only he dared. The idea first came as a whisper, a fleeting thought about control, about making his father listen in a way words never could. He shook his head quickly, as if to rid himself of the dangerous spark. And yet, the thought lingered, curling like smoke in the corners of his mind. Alex glanced toward his mother's room. Elena was still awake. He could tell by the faint glow of her reading lamp. She was always softer, more forgiving, but her silence tonight had been complicit, like a mirror reflecting his own isolation. He hated that she hesitated, hated that she seemed unwilling to defend him from Daniel's wrath. He clenched his fists and imagined confronting her too, imagined forcing her to acknowledge his anger. He swung his legs onto the floor, bare feet brushing against the cool wood. The house smelled faintly of apples and detergent, the scent oddly comforting yet alien in its normalcy. Shadows stretched across the room, cast by the streetlight outside. For a moment, he imagined the shadows moving, twisting around him like allies, listening, waiting. He was alone, yet not lonely. There was a strange intimacy in his plotting, a connection to the storm that brewed unseen in the house. Alex's mind wandered back to earlier days, when his father had been patient, when games had been rewards rather than restrictions. He remembered Daniel laughing over board games, cheering during soccer matches, celebrating birthdays without strict lectures. Those memories now felt like lies, distorted by the rigidity that had grown with Daniel's authority. Alex realized, with a cold clarity, that nothing could bring those days back. The old warmth had evaporated, leaving only the sharp edges of control. He thought of his friends at school, the laughter they shared, the freedom he now denied himself. But even in those moments, he had felt a distance, a sense that no one truly understood the tension at home. His mother's silence, his father's severity, they had become the rhythm of his life, dictating the beats of anger, fear, and curiosity. And now, with the ban in place, the rhythm had shifted. The quiet had thickened into something darker, something dangerous. Alex's thoughts drifted to the small pistol Daniel kept in the garage. He had seen it before, once, while helping his father search for tools. Its weight had seemed foreign, yet fascinating, a symbol of power he could barely touch. Tonight, the memory of that gun filled his mind like a lure. He pictured holding it, feeling the cold metal against his palms, imagining the control it promised. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from anticipation, from the dark thrill of imagining consequences that Daniel had never considered possible. The room was still, but the silence pressed against him, echoing his resentment. He whispered, to himself, words too low for anyone to hear, affirmations that hardened his resolve. He was a shadow now, lurking in the corners of his home, unseen, unheard, but fully present. The quiet had given him a strange kind of power, a space to cultivate his anger, to shape it into something precise, something he could wield. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, a low, haunting sound that seemed to echo the turmoil inside. Alex leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, imagining the weekend stretching before him, a stretch of confinement, of tension, of waiting. And in that waiting, he felt the first spark of certainty. He would not remain powerless. Not this time. The shadows in the room grew longer, stretching across the floor and walls. Alex's eyes followed them, tracing the shapes, feeling the pulse of possibility in every dark corner. The weekend had begun, but in the quiet, a darker plan was taking root, and soon it would no longer be confined to thoughts. The next evening, the living room felt suffocating, thick with unspoken grievances. Daniel sat on the worn leather sofa, jaw tight, fingers drumming against the armrest. Eleanor leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with a mixture of fear and exasperation. The air between them was taut, ready to snap, a tension that Alex could feel even from the stairs. I can't keep doing this, Daniel, Elena said finally, her voice trembling but steady. You can't control everything. He's a kid. He makes mistakes. He's learning. Daniel's eyes snapped toward her, sharp and unyielding. Learning? He echoed, voice rising. This isn't just about mistakes, Elena. It's about respect, about responsibility. He's allowed to have fun, yes, but not at the cost of his future. This ban, it's necessary. Elena shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her. Necessary? You think locking him out of the one thing he loves is teaching him anything, except resentment? You think you're building character, but all I see is a boy retreating further, shutting himself away in silence. Daniel leaned forward, hands clenching into fists. And what would you have me do? Spoil him? Let him believe that consequences don't exist. Alex, sitting on the top step, felt a cold satisfaction bubble inside him. The argument downstairs confirmed what he had suspected. His father's control was unyielding, and his mother's interference was limited, weak. He could manipulate both, pull at their weaknesses, and no one would stop him. Elena's shoulders sagged. I'm not saying spoil him. I'm saying sometimes we have to choose our battles, Daniel. Sometimes it's not about rigid rules or punishments. Sometimes it's about listening, understanding, connecting. Daniel's glare hardened, the lines on his face deepening. Connecting? Elena, he's not listening. He's testing every boundary I set. And you enable him by hesitating, by stepping in at the wrong moment. That's why nothing changes. The words landed like stones in Elena's chest, and she flinched, hurt by the accusation. I step in when it matters, Daniel, but sometimes you don't see what's really happening. Sometimes you can't feel the tension in the house because you're too busy enforcing your rules. A long silence followed, thick and heavy, until Daniel's voice dropped to a cold whisper. Rules are what keep people from falling apart. Without them, this house, this family, it's chaos. Elena's heart pounded. She wanted to argue, to shout, to break through the rigid walls of Daniel's reasoning, but she held back, sensing that escalation would only make things worse. She nodded slowly, a small concession, though her mind seethed with frustration. From the stairs, Alex watched every gesture, every flicker of emotion, every unguarded glance. He was learning too, not just about his father's temper, but about the cracks in his mother's armor. He noted the pause in her voice, the way her hand trembled slightly, the tension that ran beneath Daniel's firmness. These were weapons he could use, tools to bend the household to his will. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing the living room, the leather sofa creaking beneath him. I won't compromise, not tonight, and not this weekend. The ban stands. He will learn consequences. End of discussion. Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. She could see the determination in his eyes, the inflexibility that had characterized him for years. She wanted to retreat, to shield Alex, but she also feared what might happen if she interfered now. Something about Daniel's rigidity had shifted, over time, gaining weight, becoming something almost immovable, like iron walls around their home. The argument lingered in the air, even after the words had stopped. It left a residue of tension, a heaviness that settled over every corner of the house. Upstairs, Alex felt it seep into him, feeding a slow, smoldering fire. He could feel the weekend stretching out before him, a long expanse of silence, boredom, and seething anger. But now, the anger had focus. The seeds planted by the argument downstairs had taken root, and in the quiet, he began to imagine the steps he might take, the moves he might make, and the power he could seize in the shadow of his father's authority. As the night deepened, the house seemed to hold its breath, caught between the rigid enforcement of Daniel's rules and the fragile, faltering resistance of Elena's compassion. And in that tension, the first real cracks in their fragile family structure began to show. Elena didn't sleep well that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above her, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. and the occasional creak from the hallway. Her mind replayed the argument from the previous evening, each word from Daniel echoing harshly, each glance of his cold eyes reverberating in her chest. Alex's quiet, calculated silence upstairs had been even more unnerving. She felt as if she were walking a tightrope above an abyss, and one wrong move could send the entire household plummeting. By mid-morning, Elena had made a decision. She needed someone to talk to, someone who could help her untangle the growing knot of fear and guilt inside her. She called Marissa, her closest friend since college, arranging to meet at a small cafe on the edge of town. She needed reassurance, guidance, or at least a safe space to voice the worries she had kept hidden. As she drove, Elena's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. She thought about Alex, his quiet anger, the way he lingered near the locked cabinet even after the ban was enforced, the subtle signs that something in him was changing. She had always believed that parenting required patience, understanding, and firm boundaries. But lately, patience seemed insufficient, and understanding felt like it came too late. Marissa arrived with her usual warm smile, but Elena could see the concern immediately. "You look exhausted," Marissa said, slipping an arm through Elena's. "What's going on?" Elena hesitated, then let herself collapse into the seat across from her friend. She spoke quietly, voice trembling at first, then gaining momentum. "It's Daniel and Alex. I don't know how to manage them anymore. Daniel is strict, unyielding, and Alex, he's not just upset, I can feel something darker in him. He's quiet, but his eyes, they're different, calculating. I don't know how to reach him anymore." Marissa listened carefully, nodding slowly. "You've always tried to protect him," she said softly. "But what makes you feel this way? Has something happened recently?" Marissa listened carefully, nodding slowly. "You've always tried to protect him," she said softly. "But what makes you feel this way? Has something happened recently?" Elena's fingers twisted in her lap. "It started with the ban, just a weekend ban on video games, and yet I've never seen him so silent. He doesn't argue. He just retreats. But it's not the normal retreat of a child sulking. It's colder, like he's planning something. And Daniel's rigidity makes it worse. I feel trapped. I don't know whose side I'm on anymore." Marissa's eyes widened slightly. "Have you noticed any threats? Any outbursts?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, not yet. But there's something in the quiet, the tension. It's like a storm waiting to break. I don't want to admit it, but I'm afraid. Afraid of what might happen if this continues. Afraid that my son, my own child, might do something irreversible." A waitress brought their coffees, the clinking of cups punctuating the weight of Elena's confession. She sipped the warm liquid, feeling a slight grounding effect, but the anxiety lingered. "I feel like I'm failing both of them," she admitted. "Failing Daniel by questioning his methods, failing Alex by not intervening sooner. And in the middle of it, I'm paralyzed. I can't act. I can't stop it. And I don't know how much longer I can pretend everything is fine." Marissa reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over Elena's. "You're not alone," she said. "You're trying, and that matters. But maybe you need to take steps, subtle steps, to understand him better, to prevent anything from escalating. Keep observing, keep listening, but don't isolate yourself. And if something feels off, trust your instincts." Elena nodded, though the weight in her chest didn't lift. Her instincts had been warning her for weeks, but she had chosen silence for the sake of peace. Now, she realized, silence might be the most dangerous choice of all. As she drove home, the streets empty in the late afternoon light, Elena's mind drifted to Alex. He was upstairs, likely staring at the ceiling, thinking in ways she couldn't see. And Daniel, firm and unyielding as ever, was downstairs, confident in his authority, yet blind to the storm gathering around them. Elena's chest tightened as she realized that the coming weekend would test not just Alex's patience, but the limits of their fragile family, and perhaps the limits of her own courage. In the quiet hum of her car, Elena whispered a silent prayer, one she hoped Alex wouldn't ever hear, one she hoped could hold back the darkness lurking in the boy she loved. The silence that followed Daniel's outburst was like a thunderclap that never faded. The walls of the house seemed to hold onto it, vibrating with the sharpness of his tone. Alex stood frozen in the hallway, his hand still hovering near the doorknob, his face pale with shock. Elena remained at the table, her book forgotten, her eyes locked on Daniel with a look that mingled fear and fury. Daniel, chest rising and falling rapidly, realized too late the depth of what he had done. His words had not just been sharp, they had been destructive, reckless, like a hammer swung too hard. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence from his family was more damning than any argument could have been. "Go to your room, Alex," Elena finally said, her voice firm yet trembling. Her eyes never left Daniel's. "Now." Alex obeyed without protest. He slipped into his room, shutting the door quietly, the faint click echoing like a verdict. The sound seemed to seal off the house into two worlds, the fragile safety of Alex's room and the battlefield of the living space. Elena rose slowly, as though the very act of standing was charged with meaning. She moved to the sink, placing her hands on the counter to steady herself before turning back to face Daniel. Her voice, when it came, was calm but edged with ice. "Do you even hear yourself anymore?" Daniel rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly exhausted. "I didn't mean it like that. I lost my patience." "That's not an excuse," Elena said sharply. "You told your son he's worthless. Do you know how deep that cuts?" He flinched, guilt twisting inside him. "I was angry. He defies me at every turn. I feel like I'm shouting into a void, Elena. Nothing gets through. Maybe nothing gets through because all you do is shout," she shot back. "He's not a soldier, Daniel. He's a boy, our boy." Her words struck him harder than he wanted to admit. He sank into a chair, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped tightly as if in prayer. "I don't want him to fail like I did," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I see him slipping, making excuses, losing focus, and I can't just sit back. I need him to do better, to be better." Elena's face softened for a moment, but her anger didn't dissipate. "You want him to do better, but at what cost? If he only remembers you as the father who tore him down, what good are the grades, the discipline, the rules? What does any of it matter if he grows up believing he's never enough?" Daniel looked down at his clasped hands, shame burning hot across his skin. For the first time, he didn't have an answer. The house was unbearably quiet again, broken only by the sound of a clock ticking in the corner. Each second seemed to hammer home the damage he had done. Elena's voice softened, though it carried no forgiveness yet. "You need to talk to him. Not tonight. He needs space, but soon. And when you do, you need to listen more than you lecture. Can you do that?" He nodded slowly, though the weight of the promise pressed down on him. "I'll try," he whispered, knowing how hollow those words might sound. Trying wasn't enough anymore. Something had to change, or he would lose Alex entirely. Elena studied him, her eyes searching for sincerity. At last, she sighed and turned away, retreating to the bedroom, leaving Daniel alone with the quiet. He sat there for a long time, unmoving, haunted by the image of Alex's pale face in the hallway. His son's silence had been louder than any scream. In his room, Alex lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, the echo of his father's words ringing in his ears. Worthless. The word curled into his chest like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. He wanted to hate his father, but beneath the anger was a longing, a desperate wish that Daniel could see him, understand him, be proud of him without conditions. Yet every attempt to bridge the gap seemed doomed to collapse under Daniel's fury. As the night deepened, The house remained divided. Daniel sat at the table until the early hours, unable to move, replaying the confrontation again and again. Alex eventually turned onto his side, pulling the blanket over his head, his jaw clenched, his heart aching. Eleanor, though silent in the bedroom, lay awake too, torn between love and resentment, hope and despair. The family was at its breaking point, and though no one spoke it aloud, all three knew something had to give, but none of them knew yet whether it would be healing or collapse that followed. The silence that followed Daniel's confession was suffocating. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap, her nails pressing into her palms. She had waited years to hear those words, hoping they would soothe her pain. Yet now they only carved deeper wounds. Michael, caught between his parents, watched them both with wide, uncertain eyes. The weight of unspoken history pressed on the living room like a storm cloud. "You think admitting it makes it better?" Elena's voice cracked as it rose, sharper than she intended. "After all these years of making me feel like I was the one failing? You think words fix that?" Daniel flinched but didn't look away. "I'm not saying it fixes anything. I'm saying I was wrong. I carried guilt and I buried it instead of sharing it with you. That was cowardly." Elena's laugh was bitter, a sound that startled even her. "Cowardly doesn't begin to cover it. You made me feel small, invisible. While you locked yourself behind walls of silence, I was raising our son, holding everything together. Wondering why I wasn't enough." Michael's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to bridge the chasm opening between his parents, but his words stuck. The father he admired for his authority and the mother he cherished for her warmth were unraveling before his eyes. Daniel's voice softened. "You were enough, Elena. More than enough. My silence was never about you." "But it became about me," she shot back. "Every night you turned away. Every morning you left without a word. Do you know what that does to someone?" The tension snapped like a whip, and Michael slammed his hands against the coffee table. "Stop it!" His voice, hoarse and desperate, silenced the room. Both parents froze, startled by the rawness in their son's tone. "Do either of you even care what this is doing to me? I'm tired of being the rope in your tug of war." His chest heaved, eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. "You think grounding me, banning me, ignoring me, any of that matters? None of it matters if you two can't even talk without tearing each other apart." Elena's anger faltered, her face softening as she looked at her son. "Michael, no." He stood, shaking with frustration. "You tell me to do better in school, to be more responsible. But how am I supposed to focus when I don't even know if you'll still be together tomorrow?" Daniel rose slowly, the color drained from his face. The words pierced him, but more than that, they exposed what he had feared, that his silence, his choices, were shaping his son into someone burdened too young. "I never wanted this for you," Daniel whispered, but Michael's glare hardened. "Then change it," Michael snapped. "Don't apologize to Mom, then go back to pretending nothing happened. Don't ground me to avoid facing your own failures. If you want me to respect you, show me something worth respecting." The room went quiet again, but the silence was different now. Charged, trembling with the aftershocks of Michael's explosion. Elena pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. Daniel stared at his son, guilt carved into the lines of his face. Michael, unable to bear their stares, stormed down the hallway, his door slamming with a reverberating thud. The sound lingered in the air, a punctuation mark on the chaos unleashed. Elena collapsed onto the couch, her sobs breaking the stillness. Daniel stood rooted, unsure whether to comfort her or chase after his son. The weight of his failures pressed in from all sides, leaving him paralyzed. Finally, Elena's voice, hoarse and quiet, cut through the air. "You wanted to protect him, but all you've done is hurt him." Daniel lowered his head, the truth heavy and undeniable. His silence had protected no one. It had only built walls between them all. The house felt colder than ever, filled with echoes of pain that words could no longer contain. And somewhere behind a locked bedroom door, Michael lay awake, torn between love and resentment, uncertain whether his family could survive the cracks spreading through its foundation. The silence after the school call weighed heavily in the house. Elena sat at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched, staring at the steam rising like ghosts. Daniel paced the living room, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. Leo stayed upstairs, his door locked, his music low but pulsing faintly through the floorboards, as if announcing he was still there, still resisting. Daniel finally spoke, his voice sharp. He lied. He sat across from us last night and lied. That's not just about games anymore, Elena. That's about trust. Elena sighed, her fingers tightening around the coffee mug. He's 15. He's scared. He thought hiding it would make the problem disappear. Scared? Daniel snapped, stopping mid-stride. He was bold enough to lie to my face. That's not fear. That's defiance. The word echoed through the house. Defiance. It was exactly what Leo had been exuding for weeks. Clenched fists, curt answers, a refusal to yield. Elena rubbed her temples. Yelling won't fix this. You're pushing him into a corner. He feels like he has no choice but to rebel. Daniel shook his head, pacing again. No. What he needs is to understand consequences. If I let this slide, he'll think he can lie, skip homework, flunk tests, and there will be no cost. That's not the kind of man I'm raising. Elena flinched at the phrasing. Raising a man. To Daniel, parenting was a battlefield, a constant struggle to forge strength and discipline. To Elena, it was about guiding, nurturing, allowing space for mistakes. Two philosophies clashed under the same roof, and Leo was caught in the crossfire. Upstairs, Leo sat cross-legged on his bed, staring at his controller. His hands itched to grab it, to power up, to dive into the one world where he felt competent and alive. But he didn't. The memory of his father's glare last night lingered like a scar. His stomach twisted with dread. He hated lying, at least part of him did. But he also hated feeling powerless. Every time Daniel raised his voice, Leo's determination hardened. If Dad wanted a soldier, he would give him resistance. Dinner that night was suffocating. Elena had cooked, but no one seemed hungry. The clinking of cutlery was the only sound. Finally, Leo spoke, his voice low. You don't get it. Video games aren't the problem. You are. Daniel's fork clattered onto the plate. Excuse me? Leo met his father's eyes for the first time all evening. You treat me like I'm some project, like I'm broken, and you need to fix me. But you're the one who doesn't listen. You just punish, punish, punish. That's all you know. The air froze. Eleanor's breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. She knew this confrontation was inevitable. Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but dangerous. What's your tone? No, Leo shot back, surprising even himself with the volume. His chest heaved as if years of frustration were erupting at once. I'm sick of it. You don't care about me. You care about control. You don't even know who I am, what I like, what I'm good at. You only know my grades and whether I'm obeying your stupid rules. Daniel's fists tightened around the edge of the table. Eleanor reached out quickly, her hand covering his. Stop, she whispered urgently, sensing the storm about to explode. But Leo wasn't done. His voice cracked, raw with anger and pain. Maybe if you listened instead of yelling all the time, I wouldn't have to lie. Did you ever think of that? The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Daniel stared at his son, his face unreadable, his breathing heavy. Eleanor's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. This was the breaking point, the moment the fragile structure of their family cracked wide open. Daniel finally pushed back his chair, standing tall. Go to your room. No, Leo said, trembling but resolute. The defiance stunned them both. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a whisper. You don't want to test me, Leo. Leo rose from his chair, his body shaking, but he didn't back down. Maybe I already have. The tension was unbearable. Elena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Enough! Both of you! Her voice cracked, but it carried, a force neither had expected. This house cannot survive if you two keep treating each other like enemies. Something has to change. Now! Her words sliced through the chaos, leaving silence behind. Father and son glared at each other, neither willing to yield, yet both shaken by Elena's sudden authority. For the first time, the family stood on the edge of something irreversible. The house felt hollow the morning after the outburst. The echoes of last night's words clung to every surface, curling around the furniture, slipping between walls, and settling into corners where they would fester unseen. Eleanor moved through the kitchen quietly, setting coffee on the counter. With deliberate care, each clink of the cup sounding unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. Daniel sat at the table, staring blankly at his untouched breakfast. His hands gripped the edge as if the table were the only anchor keeping him tethered to reality. For hours, he had replayed Leo's words, each accusation cutting deeper than he had anticipated. He thought of his own childhood. Discipline without warmth, strictness without understanding, and realized with a pang that he had repeated every mistake with his son. Elena approached, her voice soft but firm. You need to talk to him, Daniel. Not now, not with anger, but soon. He needs to know that what happened yesterday doesn't define everything between you. Daniel nodded slowly, but the weight of guilt made his movements stiff. I don't know if I can fix it, he admitted, voice low. I see the damage in his eyes. I don't want to make it worse, but every instinct I have is to enforce rules, to make him obey. Eleanor placed a hand over his, a rare gesture of solidarity. Then try listening instead. For once, just listen. Upstairs, Leo lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation in meticulous detail. He traced the expressions on his father's face, the subtle tension in his mother's voice, the tiny shift in her hands as she tried to mediate. Every movement had meaning, and he catalogued it like evidence. He was not angry now, at least not entirely. He was calculating. He understood the power dynamic clearly. His father's authority was immense, but it was fragile under the right pressure. His mother's influence was gentler, yet potent. He thought about the weekends still ahead, the ban on his games, the strict rules, the emotional tightrope that had kept him balanced. A strange exhilaration ran through him. He had been cornered, tested, and yet survived. That survival gave him a sense of control he had never felt before. Later that day, Daniel attempted to speak to Leo. He knocked lightly on the door, stepping inside when there was no answer. Leo sat upright, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the window. I want to talk, Daniel began, hesitating. About yesterday. About everything. Leo didn't respond immediately. His silence pressed against Daniel, demanding patience. I know I've been too strict, Daniel continued. Too rigid. And He paused, swallowing. I see how it's affected you, and I'm sorry. Leo finally met his father's eyes, his expression unreadable. Words are easy, Dad. Actions. That's what matters. Daniel nodded, absorbing the weight of the rebuke. I understand. I'll try to do better. I need your help too, to learn how to be a father, not just a disciplinarian. The words hung between them, fragile, like a thin thread stretched across a chasm. Leo didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. He allowed his father to stay, testing the sincerity in small gestures. The way Daniel avoided looking away, the way his voice wavered, the way he stayed in the room without command or threat. Elena watched from the doorway, her chest tight with relief and fear. She understood that this was only the beginning. Words alone could not undo the tension, nor erase the simmering anger built over years. But they were a first step, a fragile acknowledgement of the fractures that had formed. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the leaves in the yard, whispering against the windows. It was a reminder that time moved relentlessly forward, that the weekend's challenges had only begun, and that the family's journey toward understanding was just starting. For the first time in days, the house felt alive with possibility rather than dread. Yet beneath the tentative calm, Elena sensed the lurking shadows, the psychological scars, the power struggles, the unspoken resentments that had yet to surface. The aftermath was not peace. It was a pause, a breath before the next storm. And in that pause, each member of the family sat with their own reflections. Daniel with guilt and determination, Elena with fear and hope, and Leo with anger sharpened into quiet strategy. The cracks in their family were exposed, fragile, yet resilient in their own twisted way. Each knew the coming days would test them further, and the real consequences of the weekend ban were yet to fully reveal themselves. Saturday morning arrived grey and oppressive, the kind of sky that pressed down on the house as if it were aware of the storm brewing inside. Eleanor moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing breakfast, but even the aroma of coffee and toast couldn't mask the tension. Daniel sat at the table, reviewing reports on his laptop, pretending to be absorbed in work, but every so often, his eyes flicked toward the staircase, toward the closed door of Leo's room. Upstairs, Leo lay in bed, staring at the ceiling with a hollow intensity. He had barely slept, the memory of yesterday's confrontation replaying in meticulous detail. Every word from his father, every glance from his mother had been logged, filed, and analyzed. His anger hadn't dissipated. It had coiled tighter, sharpening into a sense of inevitable action. The weekend ban had become more than a rule. It was a challenge, a provocation, and he felt compelled to respond. By mid-morning, the tension had escalated. Leo emerged from his room silently, carrying his controller, pretending to settle in the living room. Daniel noticed instantly. "Not today, Leo," he said firmly. "The ban still stands. You'll have no games this weekend." Leo didn't argue. He set the controller aside deliberately, as if acknowledging the punishment while harboring a hidden plan. "Fine," he muttered, voice flat, eyes unreadable, but the sharp edge of resentment in his tone was unmistakable. Eleanor watched from the doorway, worry tightening her chest. She wanted to intervene, to soften the conflict, but feared that doing so would further undermine Daniel's authority. She bit her lip, hoping for a peaceful resolution, even as she sensed it slipping further from her grasp. Hours passed with strained silence, each tick of the clock marking an invisible countdown. Daniel tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting. Every creak from the stairs, every shuffle upstairs, set him on edge. He had disciplined Leo countless times, but this quiet, brooding anger was unfamiliar, unpredictable, dangerous. By late afternoon, Elena decided to speak to Leo, hoping to diffuse the tension. She found him in his room, pacing, fists clenched. "Leo," she began cautiously, "I know you're frustrated, but this anger, it's eating you up. We need to find a way to get through this weekend without hurting anyone. Your father, yourself, or me." Leo paused, his back stiff, head lowered. "It's too late for that," he said softly. "You don't get it. None of you do." Elena stepped closer, voice trembling but firm. "I want to understand. I really do. Talk to me. Let me help." For a moment, Leo's eyes flickered with hesitation. There was a softness there, a brief glimpse of the boy beneath the simmering rage, but it vanished quickly, replaced by a calculated detachment. "It's not about understanding," he whispered. "It's about control, and I'm done being controlled." Downstairs, Daniel's phone rang, breaking the fragile silence. He answered automatically, but his attention was pulled repeatedly toward the hallway and the staircase. Every instinct screamed that the tension was about to erupt. He could feel it, a dangerous undercurrent that had been building since Friday night. By early evening, the house had grown darker, shadows crawling along the walls, mirroring the mood inside. Leo disappeared from sight, moving silently through the home. Elena, sensing something was off, followed at a distance, heart pounding. Daniel, too, felt it, an unnameable dread gnawing at his gut. And then it happened, a loud crash from the living room, followed by a startled cry. Elena rushed in, finding Leo standing rigid, hands trembling, eyes wide with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. The controller lay smashed on the floor, its pieces scattered like shards of a broken. "Promise," Daniel froze, stomach twisting. "Leo, what did you do?" His voice was calm, dangerously restrained. Leo didn't answer. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument, heavier than any punishment. It was the first true indication that the simmering tension of the weekend had reached a critical threshold. Something had been broken, something irreversible, and the family could feel it deep in their bones. Elena's voice shook as she whispered, "We can't go on like this." But even as she spoke, all three understood that the weekend had escalated beyond control. The simmering anger, the unspoken resentments, the psychological fractures, all were on the verge of erupting in ways no one could predict. The house was unnervingly quiet as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows through the living room windows. Daniel worked at his laptop, but his focus was fractured, distracted by the weight in his chest he could not name. Elena moved through the kitchen, carefully setting out dinner, but her movements were slow, almost mechanical. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of wind against the window made her stomach twist. Upstairs, Leo's mind churned like a storm. The confrontation earlier had lit a fire that he could no longer contain. Anger, humiliation, frustration, all had coalesced into a sharp, clear intention. He thought about the weekend ban, the words shouted, the authority he felt trapped under. To him, it was not just a rule, it was a cage, one that had been tightening every day. And now, he could see only one way to release it. He left his room, silently, the floor cold under his bare feet. In the hall closet, he found his father's handgun, kept for safety but rarely used. His pulse raced. He hadn't planned this when the ban began. It was the culmination of every slight, every punishment, every harsh word he had absorbed over the past week. He picked it up, feeling the weight in his hands, and the sense of control it gave him was intoxicating. Daniel glanced up from his laptop as Leo descended the stairs, holding the gun in his hands. For a moment, neither spoke. Time stretched thin and taut, like a wire about to snap. Elena, seeing the weapon, gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Leo, put that down!" Daniel's voice boomed, a mixture of authority and panic. Leo's eyes were wide, his breathing rapid. "No, you don't get it. You never understand me." His voice cracked, but carried a chilling conviction. Elena moved forward, trying to stay calm. "Sweetheart, please don't do this. We can fix this. Please put it down." Her words trembled, but carried the weight of desperation. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Leo, this isn't the way. Listen to me. Put the gun down." His hands were raised, fingers spread, a gesture of both surrender and command. But Leo had already made up his mind. The culmination of the week, the punishments, the yelling, the silent accusations in his parents' eyes, had crystallized into a single moment of action. The anger, the frustration, and the feeling of powerlessness surged through him, overwhelming any hesitation. Elena stepped closer, tears streaking her cheeks. "Please, son, think about what you're doing." Her voice broke, almost pleading. Daniel's face turned ashen. "Leo, no!" The room seemed to slow. The air thickened, and then the shot rang out. Elena screamed, dropping to the floor, covering her ears. Daniel fell backward, his eyes wide with disbelief, a hand clutching his head. Leo stared, frozen, a mixture of horror and exhilaration flooding his senses. Time felt suspended in the echo of the gunshot, each heartbeat amplified, each breath heavy and tremulous. Daniel collapsed, blood spreading across his temple. Elena crawled to him, shaking, hands pressed against the wound. But the warmth she expected to feel was fading fast. "Daniel, stay with me, please!" she cried, her voice raw with terror. Leo dropped the gun, shaking violently. He sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands, tears streaming down his cheeks. The realization of what he had done crashed over him like a wave, suffocating and relentless. The authority he had sought to challenge, the anger he had tried to release, it had all led to this unthinkable outcome. The room was filled with chaos. Elena sobbing over Daniel, the boy trembling on the floor, the echo of the gunshots still, reverberating in every corner. Nothing could undo the moment. Nothing could rewind the consequences of a single decision fueled by anger and despair. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, whispering through the trees, indifferent to the tragedy that had just unfolded within the walls of the house. Inside, a family was shattered, a father's life stolen in an instant, a mother's grief unbearable, and a son left to confront the reality of a choice that would haunt him forever. In that suspended silence, the weight of the weekend, the punishments, the confrontations, the unspoken resentments, collapsed into a single, irreversible tragedy, and the echoes of that moment would resonate in their hearts for the rest of their lives.